In my family, loyalty isn't a bond, it's a currency I was expected to pay and my account is overdrawn. I'm Gabrielle Howard. I came home to our perfect Pennsylvania house for Thanksgiving, the air smelling like wood smoke and secrets. I'm the reliable daughter, the one who sacrifices her career and pays off the debts, especially for my golden boy brother Ethan. I always thought I was just helping the family. I didn't realize I was funding my own replacement. Now I've overheard a conversation in my father's study, a plan to sign away the very future I've been working for. They think I'm too loyal to notice. They're about to find out how wrong they are. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in suburban Pennsylvania late November always smells like wood smoke and inevitable disappointment. It's a crisp, brittle kind of cold that promises snow, but only delivers a chilling tension. The leaves that clung to the maples were finally gone, making our sprawling family home, the one everyone in the neighborhood called the Howard place, look stark and slightly intimidating. It was the perfect backdrop for Thanksgiving, a holiday built on the shaky foundation of mandatory togetherness. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk and paused, staring at the perfectly placed mums on the porch. The scene was picture perfect, the kind of magazine spread that masked 1,000 underlying faults. I was back here 3 years after moving out for what I thought was the last time, having rushed home when Dad had his minor health scare in October. That scare turned out to be just that minor, but it had been enough to yank me away from the career track I'd spent 7 years clawing my way onto in Boston. Now I was Gabrielle Howard, 29, the perpetual daughter who comes home still ambitious, but currently self-sacrificing and deeply loyal to a family that demanded it but rarely reciprocated. I'd left my rent-stabilized apartment, put my big promotion on hold, and moved back into my childhood bedroom to help manage things. Help manage things translated directly into paying for the new roof, organizing Dad's physical therapy schedule, and ensuring the bills for Ethan's latest failed business venture didn't bounce. As soon as I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't cozy. It was laden like thick velvet curtains hiding something important. Mom Margaret was in the kitchen already stressing over the brine, her movements sharp and efficient. Dad Richard was nowhere to be seen, likely holed up in his study. But Ethan was there, lounging at the pristine granite counter, scrolling through his phone with a lazy smile. "Gabby, you finally made it," he announced, not looking up. "Mom, tell Gabby I need the Mercedes this afternoon. Mine is still in the shop, remember? Needs that custom exhaust." I dropped my bag harder than I intended. "It's my car, Ethan. And didn't you just get that exhaust installed 2 months ago, I remember, because I wired you the money for it?" Mom cut in, not looking at either of us, her voice a low, warning hiss. "Gabrielle, please. It's Thanksgiving. Give your brother a break. He needs that car to go pick up the centerpieces for the table he's dealing with so much pressure right now with the new venture." The subtle slight was immediate and searing. His new venture, which I knew involved importing bespoke overpriced olive oil, and which I suspected was already hemorrhaging cash, was a pressure. My career sacrifice, my continued financial support, my actual labor was just expected. Ethan's achievements, or even his attempts at them, were always lauded. My contributions were merely the invisible scaffolding that held the whole shaky structure up. I felt a familiar ache of invisibility, a ghost in my own family's house. I thought back to the college opportunities. I had gotten the acceptance letter from NYU Law, a full scholarship, the kind of future I'd worked 18 years for. The same week, Ethan got his second DUI and needed a massive lawyer retainer and rehabilitation funds. I remembered Dad sitting me down, hands clasped, telling me, "You're the grounded one, Gabrielle. You'll always succeed. Ethan needs us now. Can you defer?" Just for a year, I had deferred, then forfeited, eventually settling for a state school near home. And the money, it went straight to Ethan's mess. Debt after debt, bad investment after worse idea. I was the unseen backstop, the savings account they never had to pay interest on. Later that evening, while arranging place cards, a task Mom had assigned me because I was good with details, I noticed the whispers. Uncle Dave and Aunt Claire had arrived early, and my parents had ushered Ethan and them into Dad's study, closing the door firmly. This wasn't a general holiday chat. This was a conference. Every time the door opened, a phrase would drift out, significance of the trust, and finally set for the first of the year, and once chillingly from Ethan. She won't need to know until it's done. My ambitions stirred, overlaid by panic and dread. I knew what I was looking at. Years ago, my father had promised me quietly on my 21st birthday that a certain portion of the family's assets, the seed money for my eventual business he'd called it, would be placed in my name, a reward for my diligence. It was the only thing I'd ever asked for, not thanks, just a future investment. The hushed voices went quiet. A moment later, Ethan emerged, not seeing me standing silently by the dark mahogany hutch. He was beaming, his charm turned up to its maximum, his eyes sparkling with a greedy, satisfied light. He wasn't arrogant, he was triumphant. Then I saw the documents. On Dad's antique writing desk, illuminated by a single brass lamp, was a folder labeled Howard Trust Distribution 2026. And tucked beneath it, barely visible, was a small, ornately engraved key, the key to the old iron safe in the basement, where Dad kept the original deeds, and the heirloom gold watch that had skipped a generation. The very watch Dad had promised me the day I finished my MBA, the watch I now realized they were planning to give to Ethan. Not just the watch, but the entire distribution. It was the emotional hook. They were planning something massive for Ethan, something they had promised me, and they were intentionally excluding me. I crept closer to the study door, the fine hairs on my arms prickling. My parents were talking in low, weary voices, the tone now less celebratory and more conspiratorial. We had to do it this way, Margaret. The will was never updated, and Gabrielle would have put up a fight for the full half. Ethan needs the capital now for the olive oil company to stabilize, Dad murmured. I know, Richard, but using the health scare to get her back here to keep her distracted, it feels... Mom trailed off. It was necessary. Dad finished, his voice firming up. We made sure she was busy running the household and organizing the holiday. She's loyal, she's reliable. She's always sacrificed for her brother. She won't stop now. She literally wired him the $12,000 for the car last week. She's leveraging her own life so we can finally secure his. The crisp autumn air I'd inhaled earlier seemed to compress the oxygen out of the room. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't favoritism. It wasn't negligence. It was intentional. They hadn't just benefited from my sacrifice. They had actively leveraged it against me, using my loyalty and self-denial as a deliberate tool to prop up Ethan's life while stripping mine bare. The perfect picture of the Howard family shattered into 1,000 pieces. I backed away silently, the rage clean and cold in my chest, realizing that my role wasn't just the self-sacrificing daughter, it was the designated fool. I was in the dark, and they liked it that way. The Thanksgiving dinner was an Olympic event of passive aggression, a perfect gleaming tableau built over a chasm of deception. I sat between Aunt Claire, who kept asking if my little move back home was permanent, and Ethan, who spent the appetizer course holding court about his new olive oil importing company. The small slights were a constant drizzle. When Dad toasted the next generation of family success, his eyes locked exclusively on Ethan's proud face, completely bypassing me. When I mentioned the budget forecast I had prepared for Dad's long-term care, a significant time-consuming effort, Mom waved her hand dismissively, saying, "Oh, we don't need to talk about boring things, Gabrielle, not tonight. Ethan was just telling us about his meeting with the governor's office." Ethan then leaned over and loudly whispered, "It's sweet, you still do all the busy work, G. Keeps your mind off things." The snide comments were knives, but the truth I discovered was a blunt trauma. I had spent the afternoon during the football game distraction covertly accessing Dad's office. I found the Howard Trust Distribution 2026 folder exactly where I'd seen it. Inside, the documents confirmed that the $500,000 seed investment fund that was promised to me for my business venture was not only being transferred entirely to Ethan's name, but was being fast-tracked for a New Year's deposit, specifically to cover outstanding debts and establish immediate operating capital for Howard Imports LLC. It wasn't just a gift. It was the rescue of a sinking ship funded by the life raft they had promised to me. The betrayal crystallized everything. I looked at Ethan raising his glass, his charm effortless, and a series of memories flooded me, connecting the dots of his lifelong manipulation. I recalled the $15,000 I'd lent him 5 years ago, money I'd saved meticulously for a down payment on a small condo which he claimed was for an emergency investment opportunity. He'd never repaid a cent. I remembered the nights I'd spent reviewing his disastrous business plans, giving him career guidance, urging caution only for him to ignore every piece of sound advice, knowing that no matter how hard he failed, I was the one who would step in to cushion the fall. He hadn't just taken my loyalty, he had weaponized it. He knew my commitment to the family was absolute, and he leveraged it as his own personal insurance policy with the full appalling complicity of our parents. The final straw came during dessert. Mrs. Henderson, a respected neighbor from the bridge club, stopped by our table. She gushed over Ethan, praising his unbelievable drive and how she heard he was already set up for the new year with a huge capital injection from the family. She kept glancing at me, her smile faltering before she finally said to Mom, "And isn't it sweet that Gabrielle is back home to help Margaret out with all the little details? Such a good daughter." I was not a woman with a career. I was a glorified event planner and nursemaid. I was invisible, defined only by the support I lent to the real success story. The sorrow and self-doubt that had plagued me for hours dissolved into an icy, focused outrage. I excused myself quietly and retreated to my room. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about reclaiming my agency from thieves. The shift was absolute. I was no longer the passive victim. I was quietly, relentlessly determined. I pulled out my old laptop and began documenting. Every bank transfer to Ethan I could find in my old statements. Every email I'd sent to Dad about the need to update his will. The specific language in the trust documents I'd photographed in the study. I cross-referenced the dates of the financial leverage, the loans I'd given Ethan, with the parenthetical notes in the trust agreement, discovering that my parents had specifically cited my immediate stability as the reason Ethan required the capital more urgently. They had used my self-sufficiency as the justification for my impoverishment. Below my window, I heard Ethan laughing loudly with a group of friends who had come over. He sounded carefree, arrogant, completely oblivious that the game had changed. He thought he'd won. The parents remained in a state of willful dismissal. When I briefly brought up the trust's original terms to Mom, she just frowned, saying, "Honestly, Gabrielle, you need to stop dwelling on money. It's so tacky." Their denial only reinforced my emotional isolation and steeled my resolve. I needed more than just documentation of the betrayal. I needed leverage that would stop the transaction. The trust distribution was set for January 1st. I had less than a month. I knew the final transfer agreement for the Howard Imports capital had to be filed somewhere. Ethan had mentioned an obscure local bank, one that Dad's lawyer often used for discreet filings. I couldn't just confront them with copies of the agreement. They would lie and gaslight. I needed to know the exact mechanics of the transfer, the account numbers, the signatures, and the lawyer who finalized the transaction. I remembered Ethan had a locked filing cabinet in the small, unused study on the second floor where he kept his import paperwork. It was a cheap 2-drawer unit he'd brought home from a liquidation sale. The lock was simple. I stared at the key to my childhood room, the heavy brass reflecting the pale light of the moon outside. The time for grieving was over. The time for quiet, calculating action had begun. Tomorrow I would find a way to get into that cabinet and uncover the hidden financial records that would expose the true depth of the deception and give me the power to seize control of the narrative. Christmas Eve. The house had never looked more beautiful or felt more toxic. Pine boughs draped over the mantelpiece, the enormous, perfectly decorated tree glowed with warm white light, and the scent of clove and melted wax hung heavy in the air. The scene was designed to demand harmony, which made the cold steel in my spine feel like a dangerous intrusion. I dressed carefully, not in something festive, but something structured, something that felt like armor. I carried the small manila envelope, the one holding the evidence I'd spent the last 3 weeks meticulously gathering from Ethan's locked cabinet tucked inside my coat. We gathered after dinner, the family cocooned in the living room, ready for the ritual of gift-giving. Ethan was expansive, full of false cheer, accepting his expensive new ski gear with an air of casual entitlement. I waited. I let the small talk ebb and flow until the silence settled heavy with rich food and forced sentimentality. I stood not quickly, but with a quiet deliberation that drew every eye. The soft glow of the tree lights caught the brittle expression on my face. "I have a gift I need to give tonight too," I said, my voice steady, sounding distant even to my own ears. "It's the gift of clarity." Ethan smirked, thinking I was about to give a cheesy toast. "Oh God, gee, save the sentimentality for Aunt Claire." I ignored him. I pulled the envelope out, placing it on the coffee table where the red velvet wrapping paper was strewn. I was going to save this for the new year, but it feels appropriate now while we're all here celebrating family. "This is what you were celebrating on Thanksgiving." I opened the folder, pulling out the documents I'd retrieved: the Howard Trust distribution agreement, fast-tracked for Ethan, the loan forgiveness documents for his failed olive oil LLC, and the copies of my own bank transfers that had bailed him out repeatedly over the last 10 years. I looked directly at my parents. This trust money, the $500,000 set aside, was mine. It was promised to me for my business venture. You diverted it, leveraging my decision to sacrifice my career and move home for Dad's health scare. You used my reliability as a tool, Father, to secure Ethan's debt-ridden future. The festive veneer of the room shattered. Dad's face went white. Mom gasped, hands flying to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between me and Ethan. Ethan finally reacted, the charm slipping to reveal a panicked snarl. "That's private. You had no right to go through my things. You're being hysterical, Gabrielle. They just decided I needed the capital first, which I do." "You're stable. Don't ruin the holiday over paperwork." He tried to scoop up the documents. I slammed my hand down on the table, arresting his movement. My voice was a clear, sharp blade. "Don't you dare gaslight me, Ethan. I am not hysterical. I am clear. And the paperwork proves that this wasn't a mistake. It was an intentional, decade-long manipulation. You didn't just need a loan. You needed a lifetime keeper. And you convinced our parents that my purpose was to provide that emotional and financial labor." I turned back to my parents, my heart hammering not with fear, but with release. "I gave up NYU law for you, Dad. I paid off his first bankruptcy. I put my career on hold to manage your house and your care because I believed in loyalty. But loyalty is reciprocal. What you gave me year after year were subtle slights and a position as the designated safety net. This betrayal is the culmination of every sacrifice I made, every opportunity I passed up for the sake of this family harmony you valued above my future." The tension was a tangible, suffocating thing. Mom started crying, defensive whispering, "It's just money, Gabrielle. You know we love you." "No, it's not just money," I asserted, refusing to be dismissed. I stood tall, empowered by the knowledge that I was finally speaking the truth they had worked so hard to silence. "It is my worth. It is my future. It is the years of emotional clarity and professional grounding you stole from me to prop up his endless failures. You knew exactly what you were doing, and now you must face the reckoning." I looked directly at Ethan, whose face was now a mask of pure, ugly resentment. The smooth facade was gone, replaced by the cornered arrogance of a spoiled child who had finally been caught. "Effective immediately," I stated, articulating the consequences I am serving. "Notice to the trust executor and the lawyer handling your LLC transfer. I am challenging the legality of this emergency distribution based on undue influence and breach of fiduciary duty concerning the original terms of the asset. You will halt the transfer. Furthermore, I am leaving." I am withdrawing all financial and emotional support indefinitely. You, Ethan, are now solely responsible for your next failure. And you? I looked at my parents, their faces etched with guilt and shame. You have succeeded in breaking the one bond you could always count on. I am done being your sacrificial lamb. I didn't wait for a reply for the inevitable pleas or the attempts to placate me. I simply picked up my coat, turned my back on the silent, shattered room, and walked toward the front door, leaving the beautifully lit house and the forever changed family dynamics behind. The immediate conflict was resolved by my choice, but the cold, lasting repercussions of that final, irreversible step lingered in the sudden silence I left in my wake. The air outside the house was 30 degrees colder than the air inside my chest. I didn't drive far, just to the nearest extended stay hotel, anonymous and blessedly sterile. I retreated into the quiet, a space stripped bare of the familiar weight of expectation. The confrontation had been volcanic, but the aftermath was a desolate, frozen landscape. I had pulled the pin, but now I had to deal with the shrapnel. The first few days were dedicated to processing the grief which felt like an invisible internal bruising. It wasn't the anger that hurt the most. The anger was clean, a protective flame. It was the sorrow, the sudden realization that the foundation of my life, the idea of family loyalty that I had been building on, had been sawdust all along. I played the confrontation back not with regret, but with a cold assessment of the damage. I had lost the family I thought I had, but I had gained the truth of the family I actually had. Acknowledging that loss, the permanent rupture of the relationship I'd always longed for, was a quiet, continuous pain. I spent hours with my laptop translating my emotional outrage into legal action. The documents I'd secured were ironclad. I successfully filed the injunction to halt the trust transfer to Ethan, citing the undue influence and my long-documented history of financial support, which proved my parents' manipulation. This was the core of reclaiming my control. It wasn't about revenge, it was about stopping the hemorrhaging of my own future. The first true moment of healing came via a call from Sarah, my closest friend from Boston, who had known about the subtle ways my family bled me dry for years. I relayed the entire ugly spectacle of Christmas Eve. "You did the right thing, G," Sarah said, her voice fiercely supportive. "They taught you that loyalty was something you gave, not something you received. You weren't self-sacrificing, you were being sacrificed. You have your clarity now, and that's a win." Her validation was a lifeline, reinforcing the value of chosen family and personal resilience values my biological family had crushed under the weight of tradition and favoritism. It grounded me outside the suffocating small world of the Howard home. The calls and texts from my parents started the next day, escalating from tentative to desperate. "We need to talk. Ethan is beside himself. It was a misunderstanding. Please come home." I maintained firm boundaries. My replies were short, professional, and devoid of emotion. "The trust transfer has been halted pending a formal legal review. Any discussion must go through my counsel." I refused to be drawn back into the emotional blackmail. I had articulated the consequences of their actions, and I would enforce them. I realized empowerment didn't come from their apology. It came from the self-determination to walk away and hold the line. Subtle gestures of victory began to surface. I reached out to my former boss in Boston and finalized the negotiations for the promotion that had been postponed, the one I'd given up when Dad had his health scare. I signed the rental agreement for a studio apartment, a small independent space that felt like a fortress. I hadn't taken anything from them except my own financial and emotional freedom, but that felt like the biggest triumph of all. I thought about the family heirlooms and the holiday traditions. My reflection centered on the fact that I had allowed them to define the season for too long. For New Year's Eve, instead of performing the role of the dutiful, organizing daughter, I did something small and entirely for myself. I ordered my favorite takeout, bought a small, elegant candle, not the massive, overwrought display candles my mother favored, and sat by the window in my tiny apartment. I acknowledged the sorrow, the deep ache for the family I deserved, but I balanced it with triumph. I had navigated betrayal without losing my moral compass. I hadn't sought cruel revenge. I had sought justice, and most importantly, I had secured my independence. The finality of the confrontation, the silence in the wake of my departure, was not an ending of itself, but the necessary painful clearing of the slate for the first real chapter of my adult life to begin. The complicated nature of family dynamics remained, but my place in them was now clearly defined, outside looking in, and completely free. The scent of roasting rosemary and sage filled my small, sun-drenched apartment. It was the following Thanksgiving. A year had passed since the night I walked out of the perfect toxic theater of the Howard home, and the difference in the air and the light, in the very quality of the silence, was staggering. I wasn't arranging place cards for a family that didn't see me. I was basting a small turkey breast for my chosen family. Sarah and two close colleagues from my new hard-won promotion in the city were due to arrive soon. This dinner wasn't large, and it wasn't laden with antique silver and obligation. It was grounded in honest conversation and mutual respect. This, I realized, was the true articulation of the American value of self-determination, the freedom to build a life, a community, and a holiday that honored my contributions and my worth. I stood by the window watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. I reflected on the journey. I had moved from a state of total vulnerability, where my entire sense of self was tied to how much I could sacrifice for my brother, to a place of genuine empowerment. The sorrow of losing my parents and Ethan, the idea of them, had been a deep well, but the outrage had propelled me to action. The legal challenge succeeded. The trust funds, my funds, were finally secured in my name, reinvested into the career I'd almost let wither. The triumph wasn't the money, but the resilience it took to fight for it, and the clarity that came from enforcing my boundaries. I had navigated betrayal without becoming bitter, proving that my moral compass pointed true north even when my family's did not. My gaze fell on a small, sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of coasters on the counter. It had arrived 3 days ago, postmarked from suburban Pennsylvania. It was a simple holiday card from my parents. It contained no apology, no mention of the trust, and no request for a reunion. It simply read, "Thinking of you this holiday. Hope you are well. M&R." The acknowledgement was minimal, yet it was an olive branch, however brittle. The small gesture confirmed that the relationship, though forever estranged and damaged, had not completely vanished into the ether. But it changed nothing about my path. I picked up the card, noted its presence, and placed it in a drawer with the papers that defined the past. My independence was non-negotiable, and my boundary remained firm. The future was on my terms, or not at all. There was a sense of open-ended hope, not for a reunion with them, but for the peaceful, complex future I was actively building for myself. The final scene, my true resolution, was the dinner itself. I carefully lit the single elegant white candle I had bought last New Year's Eve, a symbolic gesture of lighting my own path. As the wick caught and the flames stabilized, I realized the meaning of the working title I'd chosen for this period of my life, Under the Winter Table. I was no longer hiding, observing slights from a position of powerlessness. I was standing fully illuminated, claiming my own space. The ultimate catharsis wasn't in watching Ethan fall. His olive oil venture had quietly imploded months ago, and he was now working a low-level sales job, but in my own ascent. My ambition had been realized not by family inheritance, but by sheer, self-determined work. The doorbell rang, pulling me sharply into the present. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. This new chapter was clean-earned and entirely mine. I opened the door to greet Sarah and my friends, ready to celebrate a Thanksgiving built on honesty, chosen community, and the fundamental freedom to decide my own fate. The shadows of the past were acknowledged, but the future, bright and full of hard-won peace, was finally ready to begin. And with the lighting of that candle, Gabrielle finally closed the winter chapter of betrayal and stepped into the clarity of her own future. If this story of empowerment resonated with you, hit the subscribe button and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts on the price of family loyalty. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.